The world's come to expect great things from UC Davis. The bold, the daring, the big ideas that do more than address today. They solve for tomorrow. As we look forward, we look to you. We're asking you to think bigger than what's possible of an individual, to make a greater difference with us. Expect greater from UC Davis for the world.
Hello everyone, I'm Chancellor Gary May. I am so glad you could join us for this Plugged In event series. Today, we are discussing something that has touched the lives of countless families and students, the impact of COVID-19 on education. As we all know, the pandemic caused a major upheaval in the field of education, from kindergarten classrooms to college campuses. Schools and families across the country had to rapidly shift to remote instruction with very little preparation. Some populations, such as younger students, low-income students, and English learners, were disproportionately affected by the change. Even as we return to in-person instruction, there is still much to discover about the impact of COVID-19 on schools and students. We also want to learn how we can use these experiences to improve educational outcomes for all students going forward. The UC Davis School of Education is uniquely positioned to investigate this impact. The school has a deep connection with the K-12 community, annually serving over 11,000 K-12 students through its teaching credential program. An additional 7,000 middle and high school students are served through college opportunity programs. With 9 research and innovation centers, UC Davis scholars are always generating new knowledge and advising policymakers, school districts, and education leaders. The quality and reach of the School of Education scholarship is also shown by its rise in ranking. Founded 20 years ago, it is already ranked in the top 12% of graduate schools nationwide. We're very proud of the accomplishments of our School of Education. Its mission centers on equity in education, and they have been focusing on the ways that the pandemic has disproportionately affected disadvantaged students. Today's speakers will share their experiences on being at the forefront of COVID-19's impact on education. I invite you to get comfortable and enjoy our discussion.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Lauren Lindstrom, and I have the pleasure of serving as the Dean of the School of Education here at UC Davis. In that role, I oversee all of our academic programs, as well as the research and innovation centers that the Chancellor just mentioned. We're really focused on transforming education, and we do that through preparing the best educational leaders, researchers, and teachers in the country. We are also committed to confronting and eliminating inequities in schooling. And our mission talks about using the power of knowledge and the promise of education. So I'm really glad that we could be with you today. We're going to talk about a really important topic, the focus of COVID-19 and how that's affected education. Now, we know that the pandemic has touched the lives of so many of you, friends, neighbors, children, whether you have children in school or grandchildren in school. I know you've recognized the impact of this time. I also just want to acknowledge that today was a especially difficult day for teachers and students around the country as we mourn the loss of 18 students and their teacher in Texas. I'm sure that's weighing heavy on your hearts right now as we continue our discussion. So today, we're going to focus really on the pandemic and the way that the School of Education has been able to respond to the challenges. And this is at multiple levels, as you'll see, for students, for families, for educators, that we have been able to adapt and be responsive during this time. You're going to hear from 2 of my colleagues and leaders in the School of Education. First, you'll hear from Dr. Carlas McCauley. Carlas is our Director of Research and Partnerships, and he also oversees one of our centers, the Reed Center. Carlas is going to talk to us a little bit about how the School of Education has pivoted our educational research during this time to respond to the disruptions of the pandemic. And next, we will have Dr. Margarita Jimenez-Silva. She's with us here. She's an associate professor and chair of our teacher education program. She's going to talk about the challenges that she and her colleagues are seeing as we work to prepare the next generation of teachers during this really complex and challenging time. After you've heard from our two speakers, I'm going to open it up to everyone for question and answer session. Some of you have already submitted your questions prior to the webinar. Thank you. If you didn't get a chance to do that, it's not too late. You will have a chance to submit questions during our presentation, and just be sure to type those right in the chat box. If you would want to direct your question to a specific speaker, just please mention their name in the chat box and we'll do our best to answer those. Once we wrap up the Q&A section, there will be a short poll. We're interested in hearing your thoughts and your ideas about how you might partner with us in the School of Education. So I'm going to begin our session with just a few opening remarks. So we all remember back in March 2020, when the pandemic first began, we had no sense of how long this would last, but we do remember schools closing down and businesses closing down and everyone going home. That happened here across the country. It happened across the world. What we know now is over 62 million students in the United States were affected by that rapid change. And we also know that teachers and administrators worked as quickly as they could to pivot and to create online opportunities or hybrid instruction. That was a heavy lift for our schools, and they did it quickly and they were quite responsive. What we saw, though, was unequal access to that remote instruction. Access to technology was particularly challenging for those in rural and remote areas. Or imagine if you're a student with only one computer in your family and your parents are both using the computer to work and your siblings. So there simply was not equal access to education during that time. Two main areas that I just want to highlight in terms of the impact of the pandemic and how that affected students. There's really these two broad areas. One focuses specifically on academic growth. And we know from early evidence that academics have been slowed down, growth has slowed down in core subjects like math, like reading, and that widens some of the pre-existing disparities that we saw in educational outcomes, including graduation rates. I'll just give you one example from one of our student teachers who teaches fourth grade. And she said to me, I started the year assessing all my students' reading level, which is a really common thing to do. One of her students was reading at the fourth grade level, one at the third grade level, and the rest were at first or second. So that's very consistent with what we're seeing, 1 to 2 year gaps in terms of the level of academic progress that we're seeing. The second piece that's really important to understand, and I'll highlight this again in the light of the school shooting today, mental health is a huge challenge for our students. Thinking about lack of access to their peers, lack of access to supportive teachers, lack of access to services and supports during this time, or uneven access. So we are continuing to see extreme, I would say, that's not an overstatement, extreme mental health challenges. And I think that we'll continue to see that, throughout the next several years. Just my final point that I'd like to make in terms of thinking about the framework. You heard earlier from me that we're especially interested in the School of Education with groups of students that have typically been marginalized and had struggled to achieve school outcomes. And so this is from a recent report by the Office of Civil Rights. They put this out in June 2021. The report's called Education in a Pandemic: The Disparate Impact of COVID-19 on America's Students. And they conclude, although the pandemic's effects will be studied for many years to come, we know from early studies that for many students, the educational gaps that existed before the pandemic in access, opportunities, achievement, and outcomes are widening. And we can see already that many of these impacts are falling disproportionately on students who went into the pandemic with the greatest educational needs and the fewest opportunities, many of them from historically marginalized and underserved groups. So these are the groups who we're paying attention to in the School of Education. I just want to highlight for you students of color, English language learners, students with disabilities, and students who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, have support needs, and we're trying to be attentive to them, again, during this time as needs are greater than we've seen in the past. Thank you, and I'm going to hand it over now to my colleague, Dr. Carlas McCauley.
Thank you, Dean Lindstrom. And again, I want to welcome everyone and thank you all for joining us, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to you. Building off what you heard from Dean Lindstrom, what we know and have learned is that COVID-19 impact exacerbated some of those longstanding problems or inequities that you heard Dean Lindstrom just talk about, particularly as we think about through the lens of K-12 education. those schools in high poverty communities that historically have been marginalized or historically haven't had access to high quality education. That was exacerbated even more so during the COVID-19 pandemic, and even continue as we continue to navigate the pandemic in this particular school year. What we have seen in many of these schools and many of these districts and communities is students continuing to see this high turnover of teachers and of principals as well. And as the data is shared and the data has taught us that poor minority communities have been disproportionately impacted. And so it continues to build off of what you heard Dean Lindstrom just talk through, these longstanding inequities that have existed in K-12 education across the country and in the state of California as well. The big thing that has surfaced throughout this pandemic, if you talk to many teachers and you talk to many district administrators, one of the things they'll share with you is that this past year or this current year, academic year, has even been, in some instances, been more challenging than the initial year of the pandemic. One of the things that have surfaced quite predominantly is this idea of teacher and school leader agency. The exhaustion that you see. You heard Dean Lindstrom talk about the exhaustion at the student level when we talk about mental health or socio-emotional supports. We're also seeing that at the adult level. We are seeing teachers and school leaders leave the profession. We've seen that throughout this academic year. And particularly as we think about those communities most impacted by COVID-19 pandemic. And why this is such a critical issue. What research has taught us is that an effective teacher has been found to be the most important in-school factor as it relates to having an impact on student outcomes. And second to that is the school leader. And in fact, a recent study by John Grissom talks about the leadership has been found to be just as important on student outcome as an effective teacher as well. And so when we are seeing the exhaustion that we're seeing at the K-12 level, particularly in communities where high poverty or students have been underserved historically, we're seeing greater context in terms of the challenge that COVID-19 presented and continues to present. And what that is leading to, and I'm going to just share a little bit about the work we've been doing here in the School of Education, has been these opportunities to reimagine what K-12 education could look like. My colleague, Dr. Margarita is going to talk a little bit about the teacher side, but I want to just spend some time talking about just from a system side. And one of the things that we've been able to do is really think intentionally and differently around collaborations as we think about our own work. What we have seen is we've been able to partner with K-12 schools in different ways. Those partnerships has included municipalities, public and private partnerships, other partnerships with institutions of higher education, all focused and centered around negating the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. Some of that have been, being intentional about how do we advance research and support around technology. How do we think differently as we think differently around cross-discipline research? When the pandemic first hit, anytime you spent time talking to school principals, sure, there was the transition into virtual learning. But second behind that, and a close second behind that, is how do we feed our students who depend on schools in many instances? And so you saw schools create these partnerships with many entities, not only feed their existing students, but to feed entire communities. So you begin to see a lot of these partnerships across fields that allowed us to break down silos because we were all working together collectively to negate and mitigate the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we've been able to continue to build off of that as we think about our own research and our own partnerships across the School of Education. And I want to spend a little bit of time just highlighting some of those intentional collaboration and partnerships that we've been able to maximize and build on, all with this purpose of thinking about students and thinking about the mitigation of the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, and help be a thought partner to communities and schools across the country and across the state of California. Just some examples as we have really been able to continue this work in spite of a pandemic, in spite of the continual transition and response to what we learned from the pandemic. We've worked regionally as we think about the work we have done in Twin Rivers and Sac City, across this university, when we think about the work with the UC Davis Student Farm and the UC Davis Mine Institute, across the state of California through partnerships with the California Academy of Sciences, other universities, as you think about with the University of San Francisco, the California Department of Education, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. But we've also been able to work nationally and internationally as well. We've, over the course of this past 2.5 years, partnered with Boston Public Schools, National Geographic, Oxford University, and the University of Vienna as well. And so although we've had the challenge and the barrier of COVID-19, through the use of technology, through the use of this intentional collaboration, we've been able to really think about this work a little bit differently than we have in the past to create these amazing partnerships with some of these entities that I just highlighted. What does some of this work look like? As Dean Lindstrom mentioned to you, we have a number of research and innovation centers who are working not only in the K-12 space, but in the community college space, in the higher ed space, all the way from practice to policy, support for teachers, support for policymakers. And I just want to spend a remainder of my time really just highlighting some of those things. Some of the things we've done throughout our partnerships is surveyed all financial aid applicants in California about the impact of COVID-19. Obviously, as you think about that, there's policy implications. And one of our research centers has worked with policymakers through this survey to really try to understand the impact of financial aid applicants moving forward as it relates to COVID-19. We've designed and developed and hosted series for youth researching the histories for better futures. It provided this opportunity for high school students to still engage in experiences and build skills and researches and build skills and resources around local problem solving. Something that was missing, not being in school, obviously, and engaging differently. And we were able to maximize that through one of our centers, Center on Transformative Justice, to really continue to bring students together and work in partnership with our students and communities. We continue to convene superintendents, not just here in the Sacramento region, but across the state of California. We've continued to convene principals, community college presidents, and as you can imagine, many of those topics revolved around COVID-19. And it was a chance and it was a community of all of these entities to come together and turn toward each other, to lean on each other, to look for support and look for ways to overcome some of the challenges that were forthcoming. Those are things we're extremely proud of, in spite of the challenge of the pandemic, to be able to bring those entities together in real time. We've also really been intentional as we think about our work. We've thought differently around how we engage with some of our K-12 partners. For example, we've had a co-design model with Los Angeles Unified that integrate essential practices, Los Angeles Unified School District, the second largest school district in the country, that integrate essential practices for math and English learners. We were learners alongside with Los Angeles Unified as they navigated the pandemic as well, navigated bringing their teachers together through this virtual platform. This particular project was teacher focused as well and built off practices and strategic goals that the district had. And it was a co-design model where we came together as a partner to design this project and funded by the National Science Foundation. We've partnered with 7 schools across the Northern California region, develop a framework designed to support families of bilingual students. And this included partnerships with family engagement specialists in school districts and teachers and principals, building off of of some of the work that we were started prior to the pandemic, and really building off of how districts are thinking of how do we engage families during this time of the COVID-19 pandemic, where we have disparities as it relates to technology, where we aren't able to meet with people internally. And in fact, these 7 districts presented their plan this past Saturday. And it was a year-long plan that we've been working with many of those districts around. We've been fortunate to work directly with some students. One of our centers developed over 100 maker kits, and these were centered around STEM kits that provided supplies and instructional videos to students. So even during this time, they could lead hands-on projects and communicate with others. And so the learning was able to be continued in spite of the pandemic. We provided direct college readiness program information to over 7,000 middle school and high school students in the northern part of our state through our college opportunity programs. We were able to engage not only with those students, but with those families as well. And that took place across 23 districts in 8 counties here in California. We've been able to offer graduate training in community and citizen science that allows students to learn about science in an active way, to get outside of their homes and go and visit parks and collect butterflies and all types of outdoor activities that they can bring back to the group as well. And we train teachers in teaching science through community and citizen science that actively engage students outdoors during a time of pandemic as well. One of the things that we've been really proud of is while we have responded to some of those real-time questions that have surfaced from many of our partners, we've established some foundational partnerships. Some were existing, some are new. We've also begun to think about how do we advance education in spite of the barriers that you heard me talk about. We've created podcasts in partnerships that highlight issues in education that think about what the vision of education moving forward. We've collected data from over 168 school districts serving 40% of the state's K-12 students to advance policies and bringing policymakers together through those learning opportunities to really think differently about how can we use this as a leverage point to build off of what we know works in education. We've developed a high school science curriculum that understand and combat climate change and environmental justice. I can add through that lens of equity, through some of that work that really surfaced, really came to light, I guess, through this COVID-19 pandemic as well. We begin to study even more so in partnership with many of our K-12 school districts and policymakers, school leadership and equity-driven decisions around K-12 schools, in part because of the disparities that were exacerbated through the pandemic. Through this work, we're helping school systems, we're helping our partners really not only look at the current issues, but not use a deficit approach, but to use this as an opportunity to advance the work of education in ways that we may not have been able to do in the past. And one example we like to use is technology. Across many of our school districts, we've been able to advance teaching and technology in ways we haven't been able to do in the past 20 years. We've been able to do that in the last 2 years. And through much of our research and much of our partnerships and collaboration, we're continuing to build off of those things by advancing education through research and practice. With that, I want to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Margarita Jimenez-Silva, who will spend some time talking to you about just teacher education work.
Hi, I am thrilled to be here with you today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about preparing the next generation of teachers. As Dean Lindstrom mentioned, I am the current chair of teacher education here at UC Davis. So we know that the teachers that have entered this profession at this time are extraordinary. These are extraordinary times. And I will say that in my almost 25 years in teacher education, I've never seen incoming cohorts of individuals who are so committed to the profession of teaching. You have to be entering the profession at this time right now. The amount of work and commitment that is being asked of our teachers right now, I think is truly unprecedented. So I want to acknowledge that first, that we're not getting students who are like, I didn't know what else to do, so I'm going to go into teaching. Those that are going into it are in it because they are committed to helping students, to helping communities, and to building the next generation of learners. So to talk about teacher education in 10 minutes is what's the word? Reto in Spanish, is a challenge, is a dare almost, because there's so many layers to teacher education. When we talk about teacher education, we need to address coursework and student teaching, both of which were heavily impacted by COVID-19. So our coursework went from being in person to having to pivot to online. And our student teachers also went from being in the position where they were attending their student teaching sites. This is back in the spring of 2020, to now saying, okay, we're all going to pivot now to virtual teaching and having to learn a whole new set of skills as they're still learning the skills of becoming a teacher in a regular classroom. Now you're adding this whole other layer. Our coursework, as I said, also pivoted to start to include or to more intentionally address the issues that we were seeing come up with online instruction. We also had to take the lead in some ways that we weren't exactly expecting to take the lead with COVID protocols. So our teacher education program starts in the summer. Our ag teachers are actually here taking a full load of classes starting in July, and then most of our other students join us in August. So we have a summer start. UC Davis fall quarter doesn't start until the end of September. So we were ahead of the game along with other professional schools, including the nursing school and obviously the School of Medicine, to think about what are the protocols that we need to have in place as we're thinking about, are our teachers going to be in person in district? We work across 22 school districts. Each of those districts were also in many ways scrambling to put protocols in place. Things like, if they are requiring masks at the school, are we also going to require, but not at UC Davis, or at UC Davis, not the school? Which one is going to trump where? Where are they going to get tested? How are we going to share those test results across the school districts with UC Davis? So just a lot of conversations around putting protocols in place, checking in even with our legal counsel to say, what can we mandate, what can't we mandate. So again, just another layer of complication that we needed to address in the teacher ed program. In many ways, yes, COVID-19 changed education, and it was a number of things. It wasn't just the pandemic, but I think the pandemic, as Carlas and Dean Lindstrom have said, brought about other changes. So we here in California, the California Commission on Teacher Credentialing, as well as the governor's office, issued a number of executive orders that really have changed the face of how we credential teachers and what's mandated. One of those is the subject matter competencies. So we have in California the CSETs. These are sets of tests that our teachers need to pass. Actually, we ask that they take them prior to entering our program to show that they know math, they know science, they know language arts. So their subject matter, that is what their undergraduate degrees are typically in. And so these tests just serve as further proof that they have mastered that. And then our responsibility as a teacher ed program is to help them learn how to teach their subject matter. And so because a lot of those things, testing sites were closed. And so our students couldn't take those exams that had previously been required. And so it made us rethink, well, are there other ways in which could be testing for that subject matter competency that maybe isn't through the CSAT? And so since the spring of 2020, we now have put a number of things in place, including some other ways through coursework, and again, other ways in which we can show subject matter competency. I mentioned the executive order and the credentialing. So we also saw an increase across the board of students of color from underrepresented groups, from marginalized communities, who decided to go into teaching. And we believe part of that has to do with the removing what often is a barrier in terms of cost. As I mentioned, those CSATs can, run about $300. They have to, if you're elementary, you also have to take the RECA, which is an exam to assess your competencies in teaching reading. The Edtpa, which is another, that is an exam that is, it's a portfolio that our students have to produce to show and demonstrate that they know how to lesson plan, they know how to assess students, they know how to reevaluate their teaching and reteaching. And so all those things, again, with the executive orders, have really made us think twice about how we're preparing our teachers. When we talk about teacher education, we often focus on our teacher candidates, but we also work. Each of our student teachers often has 2 placements. And so we're working with a great number of teachers that are out in the field. So when we saw COVID-19 hit, a lot of our resident teachers is what we call them here, or mentor teachers, we're looking towards our students and also towards our program to help them navigate the digital competencies that are now being called upon as we went to online teaching. And then our faculty and staff were also dealing with, health issues within their family, uncertainty about where COVID was going to lead us. And so again, I just am emphasizing that there's many layers in many ways in which COVID-19 impacted our teacher education program here at UC Davis and across the country and actually around the world. So one of the things I wanted to make sure that we address is that I'm sure that you've seen the headlines. I've posted quite a few of them here about the teacher shortages that we're experiencing. And we know the data is showing that we are experiencing teacher shortages in general, but specifically around certain content areas. So teachers who know how to address the needs of neurodiverse students, our teachers who know how to work with English learners, our teachers who work in the STEM fields specifically. And so we know the teacher shortage is not new. It's been coming upon us. But what happened with COVID-19 is it exacerbated, as it did many other things, the need for teachers. And what we're seeing, as I mentioned before, is that those that are entering the field are entering it because they really want to. But we're also seeing an increase in residency programs and intern programs and other alternative pathways to teacher education. Executive Order N322 also changed some of the regulations around substitute teachers. And so one of the areas in which we've been trying to be very good partners to the district with which we work, but also puts us in a little bit of a challenging situation is that many of our student teachers have been in classrooms now since the beginning of, since early August. And so they're being called upon to substitute teach. And because of the teacher shortage that the schools are experiencing. So we often have to make, and we've decided to make it an individual, a decision on individual basis in terms of our student teachers in a position where they can take on long-term subpositions or even short-term subpositions within the district or within the schools in which they're already being placed. Our primary goal is, of course, to have our teachers finish their teacher education program and become fully certified. However, if we can help alleviate the teaching shortage through having them help with substitute teaching, then we've been talking about that. We've also seen an unprecedented number of teacher retirements. Across the board, most teacher ed programs in the country and definitely in California across the UCs have seen a decrease in the number of applicants. We are down here at UC Davis about 25% right now. And the increasing tensions and responses in terms of how the media is portraying teaching. And I have to say with the shooting yesterday in Texas, I've been fielding phone calls and emails all day today about, how are we supporting the teachers in our program? How are we supporting the teachers in our schools to be able to address these challenges that are not necessary part of the canon of what you teach in teacher education, but is becoming part of what we need to address. So in addressing that teacher shortage, we are doing that through a number of different programs. So in the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Quarter at Aggie program that we have. But I also want to give a shout out to a program we have here at UC Davis, the Master CalTeach program that has lots of resources and opportunities for undergraduates who are thinking about becoming STEM teachers to try it out classrooms, to tutor, to take specific classes that gives them an introduction to pedagogy. How do you teach about science? And so they also have their own future teachers club, in which they get together and gather resources and information about different teacher ed programs in the area. Our website and recruitment committee here at the teacher and within teacher education has also been very purposeful about where we're recruiting and how we're recruiting in order to address that teaching shortage. So the multilingual education in California program is a cohort-based model in which we put a number of our undergraduate students through 4 courses and give them experience at the Language Academy of Sacramento in the hope that they'll get hooked onto teaching and apply to teacher ed programs, whether it's ours or other programs in the area. And I'm thrilled to respond that that's been a very effective way of helping address how we're recruiting for teacher education. I'm going to go through these a little bit quickly. I think this is my last slide. So just as we're pivoting and moving forward in teacher education, hopefully now we'll have the time to move from putting out fires to some meaningful reflection as to how can we continue to improve on the strengths of the program. We have new protocols and processes that are going to help us better support students. We've increased our attention to social emotional learning and physical and mental well-being, not just for our K through 12 students, but also for the students that are on their way to becoming teachers. And again, as we're addressing the needs, it's not just the new teachers, but also thinking about our partner districts and the teachers that we work with, those mid-career teachers and those experienced teachers that have lots to offer the field. And finally, in conclusion, I think that as a teacher ed program, we have the passion for and have become more intentional in enacting equity work through what we've learned. Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Dean Lindstrom.
Thank you so much to both of our speakers, to Carlas, to Margarita. I really appreciate your focus on what we had to change, but also what we're doing. And you, as you've heard from both of these speakers, we are moving forward in a lot of positive directions and continuing to support students and teachers during this time, even though it's been quite challenging. So really what you heard was some examples of how UC Davis and the School of Education is unique and innovative and reflective during this time. We did put in the chat for you if you're interested in reading more about this. We have a number of reports about COVID in education, both that look at K-12 and also at the higher education system. So we hope you'll take a minute and take a look at those resources, because we certainly couldn't cover all of it in just the hour that we have together. I do want to spend the last part of our time with some open questions and answers. Quite a few of you submitted beforehand, and I'm going to start with a couple of those pre-submitted questions, and then I'll move to some of the questions that came in during the chat. So this one is for specifically for Carlas McCauley, given the work that you do. Could you talk a little bit about COVID-19 and the impact on preparation for college as we make that transition for students into college? What have you seen there?
Absolutely. And I should say that one of the center I oversee, we also have the College Opportunity Program Center where I referenced earlier, we're working across 23 districts. Obviously, there's a big impact across the communities and families as well. But one of the things that we've seen is in previous years or prior to COVID, we've been able to spend quite a bit of time in those schools. Those particular students, part of our College Opportunity Program Center, spending time on college campuses, visiting colleges, summer programs, all the prep work that historically has shown to provide some evidence for success. Obviously, many of that had to be altered over the course of this past 2 years. And we haven't had as much access to other college campuses. We haven't had as much access to those students and communities as well for gathering. Having said that, there's a lot of effort underway, whether that be at the state, the local, federal level, to provide resources to kind of mitigate the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic by creating some of these new programming opportunities, extending funding where available to do more of that kind of work. But we know that there's a dire need because while we haven't had access through the program I oversee, for example, you also have schools, as you heard from Margarita, who were also kind of navigating the water, so to speak, in person, virtual. And so they also missed that opportunity with college counselors as well. And to have college counselors from universities also visit as well. And so there's work to be done, and there's opportunities to fill in some of those gaps. And so that's a gap that has been missed, sorely missed over the past 2 years. And it's an area that we hope that we can begin to spend more time intentionally navigating and intentionally putting forward efforts toward making up that time and space.
Thank you. And I happen to know that some of your programs also did some interesting virtual work where you were able to provide some intense and interesting instruction up to these students way in Northern California who wouldn't have had access to that because they couldn't come to campus. But through the pandemic, they were able to access it virtually. So there's that kind of flip side to it.
Absolutely.
So thanks for sharing that. Another question that came in that I'll turn to you for, Margarita, and Carlas may have some thoughts on this too, but it's about mental health, really thinking about how can our professors, how can teachers in K-12 schools, how do we support students who are facing such a mental health crisis during this time?
I think it's something that we have had a center in the curriculum. It's not an afterthought. We just had our orientation for our incoming class of teachers. And we spent quite a bit of time on slides dedicated to thinking about their support structures and thinking about before they are at a point where they need to access the resources, thinking about how do you plan for that? How do you plan for addressing the stress that any grad program that's going to be part of any grad program, knowing what the resources are at UC Davis, but also the resources that are available in the community. So in part is making sure that the resources are there and that they have access to it. It's also about us having conversations amongst ourselves and modeling how you do that. We do it amongst our teacher ed faculty, but then modeling for how they can do it at their school sites in terms of having conversations and checking in and saying, Carlos hasn't been in class the last 2 times. Is anyone else, staying in touch with them? Do you know what's going on? Do we need to reach out now? Not waiting until it becomes a crisis or that we are seeing that the student definitely needs to have a conversation about how we can better support them, and always thinking about it that way. One of our associate director, Lola Muldrew, had a great analogy the other day, and I don't know if she came up with it or she saw it someplace, but she talked about thinking about accessing mental resources is kind of like, when you walk into a grocery store and you don't think you're going to need the big a cart, you think you can carry it all. And so you don't grab a cart, but then realizing halfway through your trip in the grocery store that you really needed a cart. So thinking about having those resources available as saying, it's okay for me to stop and pick up a basket because I need some help carrying this load. And so I think changing the stigma around accessing those kind of resources and just seeing as it's a natural part. We all experience it, and we all need to make sure that we are attending to that as you're going through the program.
Absolutely. I think that's a nice way to think about it. No, Carlos, if you want to add anything else to the mental health challenges, I know you've been working closely with schools during this time, and they've reached out to us even around how they adapt their curriculum, how they think about social and emotional learning.
Absolutely. And first, Margarita, I love the example. I'm the person that goes into the store and don't think I need a cart. And halfway through, I realize I do. This year was a really challenging year in a lot of across many schools, school districts. And I mentioned this earlier. In some instances, this was even more challenging because you were continuing to navigate guidance, mask, no mask, positive cases, et cetera. There was an all hands on deck in many districts. They were short of bus drivers. All the central office staff were at the school at the school sites throughout the district. And so there was this feeling of exhaustion. And to Margarita's point, what we've spent a lot of time talking with districts about and what districts try to do is really change that stigma. That is for the adults as well as the students, that it is okay to take a mental break. I think one of the positive things that also surfaced throughout coming off of the pandemic is the move away from accountability systems. we've received a reprieve, so to speak, at least right now, as we think about accountability systems, K-12 schools, and it has made space to say to teachers, to say to principals, we're going to take this mental break. We're going to have this conversation. We're not going to do this. We're going to remove this off our plate because we are at school sites now. And my hope is that those are the things that we can continue to build on. And I do know as we enter into the summer, many school systems are really taking seriously this completely detach for the month of July. Whether you are an administrator, which you typically spend a lot of time still in July, or a teacher, while there are summer programming taking place, they are really emphasizing detaching and reinvesting time into themselves during the summer as well.
Thanks for that extra insights there, Carlas. A question just came in through the chat that I think Margarita may want to jump in and respond to. It's around related to this issue of mental health and some of the anger that we're seeing related to COVID and COVID policies. How are you thinking about preparing teachers to be sometimes in the crosshairs of those discussions?
So one of the pillars in our teacher education program is advocating for equity. So it's been a pillar for a long time. It's not something new that we've added to the program, but we've been a lot more intentional about thinking about what that means. And advocating means more than just standing up and getting angry about it. So we are having conversations. I'm not going to say we have the answer because we don't, but we're working towards finding ways to prepare our teachers to address advocacy in ways that are going to move the conversation forward. And how are you respectful in the language that you're using, at the same time, making sure that you are speaking your truth and you are addressing the issues that you want to see addressed. And modeling that for parents too. If you get into a yelling match, it's not going to solve the problem with the school board or the school district, but rather, how do you listen? How do you listen carefully so that then you can address what are the issues behind? Oftentimes it is the anger. I think whoever put that, you nailed it. It's about the anger. It's not really about that one board member or about that one policy. There's something behind it. So how can we learn and model within our courses how you listen to each other and treat each other respectfully so that you can get at what is the core issue that is really driving that anger, and then addressing that. And learning not to take it personally too, that it's not always about me as the teacher or me as the school board member. It's about larger issues that we need to have conversations about. So we're working with consultants. We're working with professional development specialists who have an expertise in this. We just had a guest speaker, Dr. Well, she's not doctor yet. She's one of our PhD students, Laurel Towers, who came in and presented to our teachers on trauma-informed practices. And a lot of the strategies that we use with the kids, we can also use with the parents when they're in that state of agitation. And then the secondary trauma that a lot of our teachers are experiencing because of what our students are going through. So again, just being aware of the resources that are out there and trying to incorporate them into the curriculum, or if there's not a space in that curriculum, through professional development opportunities for our student teachers.
Thank you. I did see one question come in that I just wanted to address very briefly, and that was a question about education department closures. I just want to clarify that we are not closing our education program. We're very committed to it. As Margarita mentioned, we are seeing declining enrollment, and that's a national trend, but we believe we have a unique role at UC Davis to prepare teachers, and it's really the heart of our School of Education. So we're committed, and I'll say that publicly, to continuing to prepare teachers in the best way we can, using many of the resources and strategies that you heard about today. I'm going to close by asking both of our panelists to answer one final question. It's more of a reflection question that came in from a participant. COVID deeply altered the educational process. What have we learned? What have we learned during that time, and how will that benefit really access to education in the future? What are your thoughts on that?
Margarita, I'm happy to start.
Yeah, please.
I think my reflection on that, I think it's a great question. We've learned to have some hard, challenging conversations, particularly as it relates to issues of equity and inequities. While we've seen some very challenging discussions, going back to the comment around anger, We've also seen a lot of productivity that has resulted from those discussions as well, whether that be through board policies, through practice. Doesn't mean we always got it right or correct, or even that we are have the final answer. But we talked about this in our opening, that it highlighted a lot of the inequities that we have seen historically. And for whatever reason, we may not have been as open to having conversations around those inequities. And as I reflect over the last 2 years, we have become more open as a field around these inequities. And I'll take a step further. We've not only become more open to naming it, we've come more open to finding solutions. And we're still in that process. We haven't found any magic pill. It doesn't exist. But we've taken steps in the right direction to really think about all, meaning all students. And that, I hope, as a field, we can continue to build on, and that we can continue to highlight some of those efforts, such as what we've done today, that advance the field of education for a better educational system for all students as we move forward.
I think that I agree with everything that Carlas just mentioned. I think that the lens of equity is something that we're taking up and taking seriously. So I want to say that first, but also want to say that I have never seen such innovation happen in terms of what teachers were capable of coming up with to support their students, whether it was teaching out of their garage or using tech tools that they had not had access to or known about prior to the pandemic. The resiliency, and I use that not as a character trait, but as a skill to think about how do you deal with everything you're dealing with on a day-to-day basis and still find the energy, commitment to teach our K through 12 students. So that, and then the commitment. In the midst of the pandemic, we still had resident teachers who stood up and said, I will take your student teachers. I will help train the next generation of teachers. So I think that's the other thing is, how we did come together as a community to support. I can speak for teacher education and didn't say we're going to put this on hold, but we really are committed to training, and I don't like the word training, supporting teachers who are going to understand how you need to be flexible, because you never know what tomorrow is going to bring or what next year is going to look like. And none of us could have predicted what happened with the pandemic, but we found ways to continue to do the work that needed to get done.
Absolutely. And thank you for both that really hopeful framing of the very difficult times, and yet we are so committed and we believe so deeply in our mission to move forward and provide education for all students that we will continue our work despite the challenges. So thank you to all of you who submitted questions and to submitted questions while we were talking. We are going to move forward. You're going to see in a moment here a poll on your screen. If you would take a moment and respond to those questions, it'll really help us understand your thoughts and your interests in our school. We'd like to partner with you moving forward, and you can help us in a lot of different ways. So let me take a moment here as we close to again thank our speakers. We really appreciate your time. We know how much other work you are doing in any given day with many students and many teachers. So thank you for taking time to speak with our audience. I also want to thank all of you who signed on today for joining us and also for your long-time philanthropic support. We truly appreciate it. As the Chancellor highlighted in his welcome, the programs we offer in the School of Education really show how UC Davis is leading the way in our communities. We're committed to that mission of being a land-grant university, and that means we work in partnerships with the community, and we believe our research and our efforts should benefit the community. So whatever your interest is in education, please take a moment, fill out that poll. And also, if you're interested in potentially talking to us about a gift to the School of Education, to support a scholarship, to support a research center, to support some of this work that you heard about today, where we're reaching underserved communities, please contact Jennifer Martinez. She's our Senior Director of Development. She's very happy to talk to you about possible ways that you can support us in the future. So with that, I'm going to wrap up and say we hope that you are staying healthy and safe, and we do look forward to connecting with you again soon. Thank you so much.